What's going on, everybody? Mortym here, this time bringing you a build for Divinity Original Sin 2, specifically the Definitive Edition, but it will work on Classic as well, of course. That said, I'm calling this the Shadowblade, which is actually one of the presets you can start the game with. Pretty much taking that as far as you can possibly go with it, as well as tweaking it just a smidge to give it some better viability in Honor Mode, which I can say with extreme confidence because this is one of the character builds I personally used to complete Honor Mode, so I can verify that it absolutely does 100% work for that. So with that in mind, one thing I want to mention before I actually jump into this is that this is assuming you know how combat works. If you don't know all the specifics of the basics and everything of that, of how combat works and how all of the environmental effects play out, as well as physical and magic armor, I recommend you check out my video on the finer points of combat in this game, and that'll kind of help you out and get an idea of some of this stuff, especially if this is the first video or character build you're looking at. So, with that in mind, we're going to jump right into looking at our combat abilities, specifically on Sabile here, but you can of course use this on any custom character as well, but this is something that Sabile is pretty suited for RP-wise. So, first things first, you want to put 1 point into Warfare, 1 point into Polymorph, and the rest into Scoundrel and Dual Wielding. Warfare is going to give us access to Battering Ram and Battle Stomp. That's the main point of it. Polymorph, the 1 point, is going to give us access to Chicken Claw and Chameleon Cloak. That's the point of that. Putting points into Scoundrel adds to our critical multiplier, as well as giving us movement speed, which lets us move farther per turn. And Dual Wielding is just straight up damage, as well as a little bit of dodge chance, which is helpful. So, with that out of the way, we're actually going to jump straight into the skills, so you can kind of see the point of some of that stuff. Now, we're going to start out down here. Flurry. You get that simply for dual-wielding daggers, which is the weapon type this class is going to be used. Kind of a standard rogue thing. Your dual-wielding daggers, which automatically gives you Flurry from your skills. Or from dual-wielding daggers, it just gives you Flurry. Now, Battering Ram, you rush forward in a straight line, hitting everybody. If they don't have any physical armor, it knocks them down. This is mostly for versatility. This doesn't actually do a lot of damage. The main thing is the knockdown. You can essentially take people's turn. Battle Stomp is very similar. It hits things in a straight line in front of you, but you do not actually move. You stand still, you stomp the ground essentially, and it knocks things down. It also has the effect of clearing surfaces, which is helpful in certain cases. Something to note with these two abilities is that a lot of people might think of these as more of a warrior type build, but warfare skills actually scale off of finesse or strength. It just depends on what you're using weapon-wise. So because I'm using daggers, these two scale off your finesse. Next is Sawtooth Knife. This actually completely pierces physical armor and deals damage. If they don't have any physical armor, it sets bleeding. Next is our big finisher, Mortal Blow. Deals a bunch of damage, and it is doubled if you are sneaking or invisible. If the target is below 20% health, it just outright kills them. Now this is where Chameleon Cloak is important. This is going to turn us invisible when we use it. So if we use Chameleon Cloak, then hit somebody with Mortal Blow, it's going to do tons and tons of damage. Now if they already have below 20%, then there's no point in using the Chameleon Cloak, as this will just straight up kill them anyway. So you don't really need that double damage if they're below 20%. But this is your big hit, and you'll notice it does require 3 source points, which makes sense because this is a huge heavy hitter attack. Next we have Rupture Tendons. Deals a bunch of damage, and when enemies move, they take piercing damage, which means it doesn't hit their armor first, it goes directly to their vitality. It's worth noting that this is not resisted by anything, so if something has physical armor, this will still hit them anyway with Ruptured Tendons, which makes sense since it's a piercing ability. Next we have Corrupted Blade. So this is useful if you don't want something to heal, because if it's resisted by physical armor for starters, but if they don't have any physical armor and you're worried about them healing, you can hit them with Corrupted Blade, which sets Decaying, and Disease, which Disease reduces health, and then Decaying actually turns healing into damage. So if they try to heal while they have Decayed on, it will actually hurt them instead. Next we have Chloroform, which deals a bunch of magic armor damage and sets sleeping. This is just one of the many ways we take people's turns away. It's basically you throw a bottle at them. It does not break invisibility or sneaking, so it pairs well with Chameleon Cloak and everything, and you can essentially take somebody's turn from them pretty easily. Then we have Backlash, which jumps you to an enemy, you land behind them, which gives you your backstab chance and positions you perfectly to use your other skills. Then we have Cloak and Dagger, which of course lets you teleport without breaking sneaking. This again just helps you kind of get into position and where you need to be to backstab people. Then we have Chicken Claw, of course. This is a great ability. This is actually one of the best in the game. And I mean that because while it is resisted by physical armor, if you take something's physical armor away, you turn them into a chicken for 2 turns. There's not much that can cure this. It takes away their turn for 2 turns and just makes people really easy to kill. Can't overstate how great this is. Then we have Chameleon Cloak, which of course just turns you invisible, pretty straightforward. Now there are a couple other skills which if you can get from items or anything like that are pretty useful. We have a 2 source point ability called Daggers Drawn, which you can hit like 5 stabs. It does a bunch of damage. It's not quite as good as Mortal Blow, but there are situations where this is actually pretty useful as well. Then there's of course Throwing Knife, which lets you actually throw a ranged attack and it can backstab, so that can be helpful in certain situations. But Daggers Drawn and Throwing Knife are pretty low priority, but those are kind of the skills you want to use. So just to now go over things like talents and everything. The first one you want to pick up is the Pawn, which gives you 1 action point of free movement per turn. This is incredible when you partner it with Scoundrel because it lets you move basically 10 plus meters in some cases with 0 AP cost. This is going to let you get into perfect position to backstab pretty much every time. It'll cost you nothing to do so, which is great for any rogue class, not just this one of course, but any kind of roguelike character who's dual wielding daggers. You're going to want to pick up the Pawn. Next we have Opportunist, which gives you the ability to perform attacks of opportunity. These can also backstab, which is great. Gorilla is also awesome. If you're sneaking, it'll increase your attack damage by 40%. Comeback Kid, which means once per turn if you die, you can restore, come back to life with 20% health. All Skilled Up, which just gives you extra combat and civil abilities. That's just kind of useful in general. A couple others that you can consider using, the Pawn, Opportunist, Comeback Kid, and in some cases Parrymaster are really great. Those are the ones I would recommend pretty much every time. I'm not using the Parrymaster in this particular instance, but that's because this character already has a ton of dodge and she just didn't need it. In terms of gear, while we're on this page, because of the way gear works in this game, it's all, for the most part, fairly well randomized. You can get uniques, but uniques don't scale to your level. The way I can pick up just some random item at any level, and it's going to scale to that level that I picked it up at. Whereas the uniques do not do that, so it's hard to recommend any uniques, and everything else has random stat rolls depending on the armor type that it is. So this requires finesse, so it's going to give me finesse-based bonuses such as plus to finesse, obviously, Scoundrel, things like that. So the best advice I can give you with armor is look for the stuff that requires finesse to use, and that's going to roll the bonuses you need pretty consistently. Some of the stuff you want to look for is plus dodge chance, plus crit chance, plus dual wielding, plus Scoundrel, plus if you can get a dagger that does set atrophy, that's pretty good. But those are kind of the ones you're looking for. The only unique I would recommend keeping pretty much all game for this is the Shadow Prince's Signet, as it will give you Chameleon Cloak, which means you don't have to put it on your memorized skills because this item will give it to you and you'll have it all the time. So for armor, obviously we have to use the 2 daggers because that's where most of our damage from this class comes from, and it lets us backstab, critical, and everything else, so you kind of have to dual wield daggers to do this properly. But armor-wise, just remember anything that requires finesse and just the best that you can from there. But because of the way they randomly roll things, I can't specifically give you, like, you need to use this exact thing, kind of, basically. So from there, when we look at our attributes, we're going to focus on finesse and constitution. Now, we don't really need to put anything into anything else. Strength is not useful for this. Intelligence is not useful for this. Memory isn't terrible, but we just don't need a lot of skills. By the time you get to in-game, you'll have pretty much the appropriate amount. You can get +3 from Rooted, especially if you use Sabille, which is why she has a little extra memory, and I picked up Daggers Drawn and Throwing Knife with this class. But memory is pretty useless. You don't need to use Wits, because the main thing Wits does is give you crit chance, which you don't need if you're already dual wielding and getting guaranteed backstab criticals, so kind of redundant. So that's pretty much going to do it, guys. The key thing to remember with this build is that obviously you want to backstab people, which requires you to be behind them. So you want to sneak into position as best you can, and do that by literally sneaking into position if you want to, or in combat, when the turn starts, you can use all of that free movement you get with the pawn to position yourself appropriately, use backlash, cloak and dagger, whatever you got to use to get behind somebody, backstab the crap out of them, and then take the advantage of the fact that they won't have any physical armor. Use it with chicken claw, etc. Like I said, this is very honor viable. I used it to complete honor mode myself. Some useful tips for that. Some useful things to keep in mind for this is a primary damage dealer, but again, I built it in such a way that it has so much utility to basically steal enemies' turns through knockdowns, sleep, chicken claw. All of those things are basically designed to be as disruptive to the enemy party as possible. The only real con to it is that early game, it's a little bit squishy. You don't have access to a lot of really good stuff in the Act 1 and then kind of the first part of Act 2. It can be a little on the squishy side, so you kind of really got to watch the positioning and everything. Barring that, it's really fun to play. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you need anything, by all means, feel free to ask questions, comments, all that stuff down in the comment section below. But other than that, I hope you subscribe and stick around, but have a great day either way.